My father, Victor Sterling, built his empire on steel and glass. It was called Sterling Industries, and it rose up high above the city, a towering promise of power and money. From the outside, our life was perfect. We lived in a mansion that looked like a museum, and I, Alexa, was the only daughter of the city's king. But inside, everything was cold. My father was never home, and when he was, his mind was always on the next deal, the next skyscraper. I learned early that the walls around us were thick, not just with expensive wallpaper, but with silence. My mother, Clara, moved through the big rooms like a quiet ghost, always tense, always watching my father's moods. The wealth was suffocating. It felt more like a golden cage than a home. I often wondered what it felt like to live in a normal house, where people laughed instead of whispering. I knew my father was strong, but lately I saw a flicker of worry in his eyes, like a tiny crack starting to show in a massive wall. The first real crack happened last winter. A section of wall fell at one of Sterling Industries' biggest construction sites, the future home of the Grand Pinnacle Tower. It was just a small, pre-dawn accident, a concrete slab that wasn't set right. Nobody was hurt badly, but the news whispered about it for a day. When I brought it up at the dinner table, a huge table that usually held only the three of us, my father slammed his fork down. The sound echoed through the dining room. "It was a minor issue, Alexa," he said, his voice flat and hard. "Construction always has small hiccups." He gave me a look that made my stomach clench. It was the same look he gave his junior managers when they made a mistake, a warning to stop asking questions. My mother quickly changed the subject to school, her voice too bright, but I couldn't forget the way his eyes had darted away. It wasn't the sound of concrete falling that bothered me. It was the way my father refused to talk about why it fell in the first place. My relationship with my father was built on grades and silence. He expected straight A's, and he expected me to stay out of his business. He talked about legacy a lot. "You will take this over one day, Alexa. You must be prepared." But what was I preparing for? The only thing he ever let me near was his private library, a huge room filled with old, dusty books about engineering and finance that I didn't care about. He never asked about my friends or my dreams, only about my future role. I felt like a character in a play he was directing, not a real person. As the years went on, the distance grew wider, a gap I couldn't cross. I started spending hours just observing him from a distance, trying to find the man my mother said she married. I saw a man who worked late, took nervous phone calls, and guarded his documents like they were treasure. The gold of his empire felt heavy on his shoulders, and sometimes he looked like he was about to collapse under the weight of it all. My father had a private office on the ground floor of our mansion, a room no one was allowed to enter. It was locked with a heavy oak door and a digital keypad. I had watched him punch in the code maybe 100 times, but I could never remember the numbers. I knew that room was the heart of the empire in our home. He kept blueprints, contracts, and a heavy, old-fashioned safe in there, hidden behind a large portrait of my great-grandfather. One afternoon, my father left for a quick, unexpected trip, and my mother was out. I found the spare key, which he foolishly kept under a chipped teacup on his bedside table. My hands shook as I turned the key. Inside, the room smelled like old paper and expensive leather. I didn't touch anything, just looked until I saw something odd. The wall behind the heavy bookshelves looked recently disturbed, slightly lighter than the rest. It wasn't a hidden safe, but a hidden door. The moment I saw that subtle seam in the wall, I knew the real secrets weren't in the open safe. They were behind that door. It was a small space, barely big enough for one person, leading to an old utility tunnel in the back of the house that hadn't been used since the mansion was built decades ago. The next weekend, under the guise of going to the park, I drove our old gardener's truck to the abandoned Sterling family estate on the edge of the city. My father had bought it years ago but let it fall into disrepair, calling it unlucky. The old house was a wreck of peeling paint and broken windows, but the deed was still in his name. I pushed open the creaking back door and went to the basement. It was dark, dusty, and smelled of damp earth. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, searching. This place felt like a proper secret, far away from the sterile perfection of our modern home. It felt like the perfect place to hide the truth about a crumbling empire. I found it near the old coal chute in the corner of the basement. It was a section of the floor, not rotten like the rest, but simply newer wood, slightly darker, fitting too snugly. I knelt down and ran my fingers along the edges. There was no handle, but after pushing and pulling for a frantic 10 minutes, I found the loose floorboard. It lifted with a groan that sounded loud enough to wake the dead. Underneath, wrapped in a thick, oil-stained canvas, was a small, locked wooden chest. It was old, maybe 50 years old, with heavy brass fittings and a lock that looked like a puzzle. My heart hammered in my chest. This wasn't something about money or taxes. This felt personal, ancient, and deeply wrong. I carried the heavy box back to the truck, covering it with a tarp. Driving home, I felt a terrible thrill, like I was holding a ticking time bomb. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, that my father's legacy was stored inside this weathered piece of wood. Getting the box open was a problem. The lock was stubborn and antique. I considered smashing it, but that would destroy the evidence. I ended up digging through my grandfather's old tool chest in the garage and found a tiny, thin piece of wire and a set of antique skeleton keys. It took me 3 solid hours, hidden in my locked bedroom closet, the sound of my father's booming voice from the hallway reminding me to hurry. Finally, the third skeleton key turned with a rusty, grating sound. The brass fittings sprang open. I held my breath, lifting the heavy lid. Inside, there was no gold, no cash, just paper. Stacks of yellowed paper, tied with brittle ribbon, and one rolled-up canvas scroll. The silence in the closet felt huge, like the whole world was waiting for me to read the first word. The very first piece of paper was a letter dated 15 years ago, addressed to my father. The letter was signed by a man named Arthur Vance. The name sparked a tiny recognition in my memory. Arthur Vance had been my father's partner, the one who left the company suddenly, years ago, after a huge disaster. Everyone said Arthur was reckless and ruined the Regal Tower project, forcing my father to take over and save the company. But this letter told a different story. Arthur wrote that he was being forced out. "Victor," the shaky handwriting read, "you know the materials are faulty. You know my plan was safe. If you use that inferior steel in the core structure of Regal Tower, it will be a death trap. And when it fails, you will pin it on me. I know you will." The letter was desperate, raw with panic and accusation. I read it twice, then a third time, my stomach twisting with cold dread. My father hadn't saved the company. He had destroyed his partner to take everything for himself. The next few documents were copies of official company reports and signed testimonies. They confirmed the worst. Arthur Vance was indeed framed. The Regal Tower collapse, which had been quickly covered up as structural failure due to Arthur Vance's faulty designs, was actually caused by a switch in the steel order. The reports showed my father signed off on cheaper, less stable steel, overriding Arthur's specific warnings. Arthur's career, reputation, and freedom were all destroyed. He served time in jail for negligence, the letter explained, while my father took his half of the company and built it into the Sterling Empire. It wasn't just a business lie, it was a crime. The memory of my father talking about his hard work and sacrifice felt like a sour joke. The golden cage suddenly felt like a tomb, built on the suffering of an innocent man. The knowledge was heavy, like I was carrying the weight of the Regal Tower itself. I unrolled the canvas scroll. It was an enormous old blueprint, stamped with the logo of Sterling Industries and dated just before the Regal Tower collapse. The paper was fragile, but the ink was clear. Arthur Vance's original design was drawn in black, detailing high-grade, expensive support beams. My father's handwriting, scrawled in thick red pencil, was unmistakable. He had crossed out the expensive beams and written in the cheap material code. Next to it, circled 3 times, was a note. Cost reduction vs. It was the smoking gun, the final piece of evidence that proved malicious intent. It showed that my father knew the risk and chose the cheaper, dangerous route anyway, all for extra profit. This wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate choice to risk lives. I stared at the red lines until my eyes burned. The man I called father was not a king. He was a thief and a danger. I put the blueprint away, my mind spinning. The real terror hit when I remembered the recent Grand Pinnacle accident. I went straight to my father's office, the public one this time, and grabbed a current set of blueprints for the Grand Pinnacle Tower. I laid the new plans out next to the old Regal Tower blueprint on my bedroom floor. I compared the foundation schematics, specifically the load-bearing supports. My hands started to shake uncontrollably. The material code circled in red pencil on the old Regal Tower blueprint was the exact code listed as the primary support material for the Grand Pinnacle's foundation. It was the same cheap, unstable material. My father hadn't learned his lesson. He was simply repeating his crime, but on a bigger scale. If the Regal Tower failed because of this flaw, the Grand Pinnacle would also fail. Now, the truth wasn't just history. It was a present danger, threatening thousands of future lives. I couldn't just hold this secret anymore. I had to reveal it. I walked out of my room and looked at the mansion. Every polished floorboard, every priceless vase, every silent wall was suddenly covered in Arthur Vance's blood and tears. The moral conflict was agonizing. This was my father, the man who taught me how to tie a shoe, the man whose name I carried. But he was also a criminal who was about to risk a disaster just to save a few $1,000,000. Could I betray him? Could I watch him destroy himself and others? The answer was a painful, absolute yes. The safety of countless innocent people who would one day live and work in the Grand Pinnacle was more important than my father's legacy or my own comfortable life. I couldn't tell my mother. She would break or, worse, try to stop me out of misplaced loyalty. I was completely alone with this horrible, dangerous truth. I needed help, someone who knew the old world of Sterling Industries and wouldn't be afraid of Victor Sterling. I thought back to the names in Arthur Vance's documents. One name kept popping up, Marcus Thorne. He was described as Arthur's most trusted foreman, a man who had left Sterling Industries shortly after Arthur's downfall, disgusted. I knew Marcus was still around because I'd seen his name listed as a project manager for a smaller construction firm that often bid against Sterling Industries. Marcus was the key. He would understand the blueprints, and he would have the courage to act. I spent an entire afternoon digging through old city directories and finally found a phone number for Thorne Construction. I dialed the number, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. When a gruff, tired voice answered, I almost hung up. "Mr. Thorne," I managed to squeak out. "This is Alexa Sterling. I have something important about my father, something about Arthur Vance." Marcus Thorne paused on the other end of the line, and the silence was heavy, like a large stone dropped in a well. Then he just said, "Meet me tomorrow at the public library downtown. Main reading room, exactly 3 p.m. Don't call this number again and don't tell anyone." His voice was low and serious. The next day, I dressed in clothes that didn't look expensive and drove my own old car to the meeting. The library was bustling, a perfect place to hide. Marcus was sitting at a far table, a stocky man with a face full of worry lines. He looked older than his picture. When I sat down, he didn't offer a greeting, just stared at me. "Why are you here, Alexa?" he asked, his voice a gravelly whisper. I took a deep breath and pulled the folded letter and a photo of the blueprint from my backpack. "My father framed Arthur Vance," I whispered back, "and he's about to make the same mistake with the Grand Pinnacle." Marcus's eyes widened as he read Arthur's desperate letter. When he saw the photograph of the blueprint with my father's red pencil marks, his face turned a cold, angry red. He slammed his hand down on the table, not hard enough to draw attention, but hard enough to make me jump. "I knew it," he hissed, his voice tight with years of repressed rage. "I knew Victor was a snake. Arthur died a broken man, Alexa. Victor stole his life, and I couldn't prove it." He looked at me, his expression softening slightly. "Why are you doing this? You're giving up everything." I just shook my head. "He's going to kill people, Marcus. The Grand Pinnacle will fall. I can't be part of that silence." Marcus nodded, a slow, grim understanding passing between us. He had his own motive, justice for his friend. We were allies now, bound by the terrible, dangerous truth about the Sterling Empire. My father noticed the shift in me immediately. I was quieter, more watchful, and he saw it. One evening, he came into the library where I was pretending to study. He stood by the fireplace, warming his hands. "You seem preoccupied, darling," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes were sharp. "Is everything all right? Are you feeling the pressure of the upcoming announcement?" The Grand Pinnacle announcement was only days away. "I'm fine, Father," I said, trying to sound bored. "Just tired of studying city planning." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good, because in a few days the world will see that Sterling Industries is untouchable. Remember, Alexa, loyalty is everything, everything. People who betray trust are weak, they crumble." It was a test, a veiled threat. I swallowed hard, feeling the letter and the blueprint hidden under my mattress. I knew then that I had to move fast before he figured out what I was planning. Marcus had a contact, Anya Petrova, a famous investigative journalist known for taking down corrupt businessmen. "She's fearless, Alexa," Marcus assured me during our next secret meeting. "And she hates Victor Sterling's kind of power." The plan was set. Victor was holding a massive press conference on Thursday morning to unveil the final designs for the Grand Pinnacle, a moment meant to show his untouchable status. We decided that Anya had to break the story during the conference. The timing had to be perfect. Just as my father reached the peak of his hubris, we would pull the rug out from under him. The evidence had to be overwhelming, and I realized I needed one final, unassailable piece of proof, something recent. I needed to show that the cheap material was not just planned, but had been ordered for the Grand Pinnacle. My biggest risk came 2 nights before the press conference. My father was hosting a large, loud business dinner. I put on my darkest clothes and slipped into his private, locked office. I had memorized the code after watching him enter it so many times. The light felt blinding when I turned it on. I went straight for his main computer. I knew he kept his supply orders digital, secured in a folder named Legacy. My hands were shaking so badly I almost couldn't type the password. But I got in. There it was, the order for the inferior steel beams, dated just last month, signed by him. I quickly took a high-resolution photograph of the screen with my burner phone, making sure the file name and date were clearly visible. I slipped out just as the laughter from the dining room peaked. I felt cold and sick, but the picture in my hand was the final, undeniable proof. The empire was ready to fall. The night before the press conference was the longest night of my life. I couldn't sleep. I just walked the silent halls of the mansion, listening to the expensive clock tick. My father was in a mood of arrogant triumph. He kept calling my mother to the drawing room, making her listen to his speech one last time, practicing his confident gestures. I avoided him completely. I felt like a spy in my own home, a hidden wire in the walls of the golden cage. Every time I saw his confident smile, I saw the faces of the people who would be hurt if I stayed silent. I looked at the dark city outside my window, at the lights of the buildings he owned. Tomorrow, everything would change. My name would be mud, my inheritance would be gone, and my father would be ruined. But Arthur Vance would be proven innocent, and the Grand Pinnacle would be saved. Dawn broke cold and gray. I didn't eat breakfast. I waited for my father to leave for the conference center, then grabbed the heavy envelope. Inside were the 3 pieces of evidence: Arthur Vance's letter, the photograph of the old Regal Tower blueprint with the red mark, and the recent photo of the Grand Pinnacle steel order. I drove to the industrial park where Marcus was waiting in a plain car. I handed him the envelope through the window. "It's all in there," I whispered, my throat tight. "The final order, everything." Marcus looked down at the envelope, then back at me. There was a look of deep respect in his eyes. "You did the right thing, kid," he said. "This is going straight to Anya. It's over for him." As I drove away, watching the plain car vanish, I felt an awful, hollow relief. The truth was out of my hands. The crumbling of the empire was no longer just a possibility, it was an active event. I arrived at the Grand Pinnacle press conference an hour later. The hall was packed with reporters, investors, and city officials. My father was the star. He stood on the stage, the Sterling Industries logo blazing behind him, all charm and powerful confidence. He was introducing the project with a smooth, practiced elegance. My mother sat stiffly in the front row, forcing a proud smile. I took a seat far in the back, near the main exit, feeling like I didn't belong to this world anymore. I watched him talk about vision and durability, and every lie felt like a physical blow. He was almost to the big reveal of the final design when I saw Anya Petrova, the journalist, slip quietly into the room, holding a tablet with an intense look on her face. The countdown had begun, and the air in the room felt thick and ready to explode. My father hit the grand finale of his speech. "And I promise you today the Grand Pinnacle Tower will stand for 100 years, a monument to our city's strength." At that exact moment, 2 things happened. First, a tiny electronic beep sounded in the room as every reporter's phone and tablet received a push notification. Second, Anya Petrova stood up in the front row, holding up her tablet screen. "Mr. Sterling," she shouted, her voice cutting through the applause. "Can you comment on the documents released just now, showing you used substandard steel in the Regal Tower and ordered the same material for the Grand Pinnacle?" The room went instantly silent. The investors looked sick. My father's confident smile froze, then melted into a look of pure, horrified shock. He looked frantically toward the screens, where the documents were already being projected by a quick-thinking technician. My father didn't look at the screens. He didn't look at the horrified crowd. He looked straight at me. Our eyes met across the vast, chaotic room. He knew. He could tell by the cold truth in my eyes, the terrible certainty in my posture. He saw the empty guilt in my face, and he knew I was the source. His face went from shock to a terrible, controlled fury I had never witnessed. He rushed off the stage, pushing aside 2 reporters. He charged toward me, his hands clenched into fists. "Alexa!" He roared, a sound that was less a name and more a physical threat. "You told them. You ruined everything." He grabbed my arm so hard it bruised immediately. "This was your legacy, your life." I stood my ground, pain shooting up my arm. "It was a lie, Father," I said, my voice steady despite the fear. "And you were going to hurt innocent people again. I had to." Just as my father raised his hand, 2 plainclothes officers who had been waiting nearby with Marcus stepped in. "Victor Sterling, you are under arrest," one of them said clearly, reading him his rights. The struggle was quick and messy. My father fought them, screaming accusations and threats, his powerful image dissolving into that of a cornered, desperate animal. As they led him out in handcuffs, the entire conference hall descended into utter chaos. Reporters shouting, investors fleeing, cameras flashing blindingly. My mother, utterly white, was led away by one of her staff members, crying silently. The Sterling Empire, that vast, glittering, and fraudulent structure, was crumbling in real time, like a building imploding in a controlled, yet shocking, explosion. By nightfall, all his assets were frozen, all his projects halted, and Sterling Industries was a name in a massive police investigation. The truth had won. The next few weeks were a blur of lawyers, police questions, and media frenzy. I cooperated fully, handing over the original box and all the documents. Our mansion was seized and emptied. My mother and I moved into a small, quiet apartment on the other side of the city. We barely spoke, but the air between us was cleaner, free of the tension and the lies that had defined our lives for so long. She eventually understood. "You saved people, Alexa," she whispered to me one night, finally looking at peace. The fortune was gone, the golden cage destroyed. I didn't mind. I started university, studying architecture, hoping to one day build something honest and safe. I had betrayed my father, ruined my life of privilege, and watched the world he built fall into dust. The cost was everything, but I woke up every morning with a clear conscience. I had chosen truth over blood, safety over silence, and in that choice, I found a kind of freedom that was worth more than any empire.